There's a new way to enjoy Imagination Skyway. You can now listen for free with or without a Patreon account by heading to patreon.com/imaginationskyway. Here you can enjoy the show free from programmatic ads and read through listener comments on specific episodes. Plus, sign up for a free member account to engage with other listeners on specific episodes and enjoy bonus content, or sign up for a free 7-day trial of one of our paid subscription options for even more content. Learn more at patreon.com/imaginationskyway. Welcome aboard Imagination Skyway, your grand podcast tour of the magic. I'm your host, Matthew Krull, and in today's episode, I have the pleasure of chatting with former Walt Disney Imagineer Aarin Richard. As an Imagineer in the 1990s, Aarin contributed to countless projects you know and love across the parks. His projects included the first synchronized onboard audio track for Space Mountain at Disneyland and Space Mountain at Disneyland Paris, as well as the music for the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, Indiana Jones Adventure, and beyond. In this episode, I chat with Aarin about his early career, his work at Disney, and his favorite projects beyond Imagineering. At the end of the show, we'll return to Imagination Central, where I'll share ways in which you can stay connected with Imagination Skyway, how you can discuss this topic with others, and how you can help support and inspire the future of this show. Please remain seated, keep your hands and arms inside the podcast at all times, and enjoy your Grand Circle tour aboard Imagination Skyway. When we think of Imagineering, many Disney fans immediately recall the visual and physical side of the parks, like the realistic-looking rock work of Expedition Everest, Legend of the Forbidden Mountain, the Pepper's Ghost effect on the Haunted Mansion, or the dynamic Omnicoaster system created for Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind. Imagineers, though, work with all the senses, and one of my favorites involves not what you see, but what you hear, especially as it applies to music, whether it's the thrilling soundtrack of your favorite roller coaster or the inspiring medley created for your favorite nighttime spectacular. Music amplifies the emotion of our Disney parks experiences. My guest today is an Imagineer you might not know by name, but you almost certainly know his work, collaborating on such iconic attractions as Space Mountain, Indiana Jones Adventure, and Tower of Terror. Aarin Richard has composed, produced, and designed some of your favorite music at Disney, and I'm incredibly excited to chat with him today about his work at Imagineering and beyond. Aarin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. We got the chance to chat a little bit before we started recording, and I'm really interested in hearing more about your story. And I want to go back and start, like I do with so many of my guests, at the beginning by discussing some of your, before you even landed on a career, some of your earliest interests. I find that especially with guests I've had who have worked in music, music has been, in many cases, a lifelong passion. Is that the same case for you? And what are some of your earliest interests?
Yeah, well, I started into music fairly early, I guess, probably like in the 4th grade. And it wasn't any high impassioned calling. It was really more that I happened to notice that kids were able to get up and leave class early to go to band practice, right? So I thought, hey, that's a pretty good deal. So I went down and I joined the band, and I started in on trumpet, and really, trumpet wasn't my most inspiring instrument, but by the time when the Beatles came out, I got into guitar, and then the inspiration really kind of, clicked in. And so by the time I was actually in college, I was making money as a musician, and that kind of launched my career into being a full-time musician through my 20s and probably into my early 30s. And so, I was writing music and playing in bands and pretty much all about music at that time, trying to get record deals and trying to sell songs and, peddling songs around Hollywood and stuff. But at some point I decided that it would behoove me to become a recording engineer. really more so that I would have more control over my destiny in the studio, because I was in, recording my own demos and stuff. But lo and behold, I ended up getting work as a recording engineer. And at first I was doing, rock and roll and some R&B and funk bands and stuff like that, and some well known, some not. And but that type of music and the recording hours could be like into the wee hours of the night, and it just became a burnout. So at some point, I started shifting over into what's known as post-production audio, because the hours are just, more normal. And really, I think that move into post-production is what helped me get the job at Disney.
It's incredible. Not anywhere near the same career you have, but when I was in elementary school, middle school, high school, I ended up playing trumpet as well. That was my first instrument. That was the instrument I played. I was in jazz band, wind ensemble. So I did stop when I entered into college, but my cousin, who's also a repeat guest on this show, talks a lot about music and works in the music industry. Also played trumpet. My uncle played trumpet. It's we have a big trumpet family.
What's funny is I was never really very good at trumpet, and years later, my first wife was actually a really good trumpet player, and I still had that old trumpet. She picked up and played it, and she says, "Oh my God, how can you even get anything out of this thing? No wonder you sucked at it."
It's all about the instruments, literally and figuratively. So you teed me up to talk about landing at your role at Disney. How did that come about?
Yeah, so like I said, I was doing, more or less post-production work at that juncture, and I was independent, so like all good independents, when work gets slow, you get on the horn and try to drum up some work, right? So I still remember one day I was thinking, who should I call? And I thought, well, Disney, they make a lot of movies and stuff. They must need some extra help here and there. So I called directory assistants, and I said, give me the number for Disney, please. So I called the number, and I said, connect me to the head of audio. So they connect me to this guy named Ken Lisi at the time, and we have this conversation. He grills me about my qualifications and everything, but he's really not specific at all. He just says, we're going to be expanding. We have a bunch of projects coming up, and that was kind of it. We hung up, and I forgot about it. And like 6 months later, I get a call, and they said, hey, they want you to come in for an interview. So I go to this address, 1401 Flower Street, right? And I know, like, the film studio's the other direction. And I'm thinking, well, this must be like the human resource department or something. So I go in, do some paperwork, and they lead me down the hallway to the office of Kurt Kinzel, who was the head of audio at that time. So we're doing this interview, and he's talking, about kind of what they're doing, but he's using terminology that was like kind of foreign to me, right? And at some point, I finally said, "Well, what about the films? Tell me about the films you're working on. Surely you must need some help with those." And he looked at me kind of odd, and he said, "Well, this is Imagineering. We do theme park stuff. This isn't the film studio." And it wasn't until that very second that I realized, hey, I'm not being interviewed for the film studio. This is like something that was not even on my radar. So nonetheless, I got hired, and then there I was, all from a cold call.
Which is incredible. You can't do that today. It's a very different world. It's hard there is no direct number. If you find some way to get a direct contact, you really got to network your way to that point. Had you been to the Disney parks before then, or was that completely foreign for you?
No, I had been a couple times down to Disneyland. I had moved to California in, I think it was 73. And so I made 2 or 3 trips to Disneyland just for fun, but I was never, what you would consider a Disney fan. It was just a thing, and like I said, theme park audio, video, it was not even on my radar at all, and and still I got hired.
Yeah, it's great that you did, because like I mentioned in the beginning, you worked on some really iconic attractions that a lot of Disney fans would recognize. And the one I definitely want to hone in on, especially here at the beginning of this, is Space Mountain. And that became a standard, I think, now for onboard ride soundtracks with a lot of Disney, like so many Disney attractions now. We think, especially roller coasters, there's some sort of onboard soundtrack that accompanies it. And when Space Mountain opens in Disneyland in 1977 and Walt Disney World in 1975, the technology wasn't quite there yet. And here you are working at Imagineering at a time when the technology does get to the point where that dream can be realized. What do you remember about working on the Space Mountain project? And I think there were two, right? There was Space Mountain in Disneyland, and then also Space Mountain at Disneyland Paris, or then Euro Disney.
Yeah. Well, let me preface that a little bit by saying that, in the mid-90s, we had these, several large attractions that were coming up, some of which you already mentioned, right? And they all had robust music requirements. So at that time, really, I was the only person with extensive experience in creating and recording music and producing in the studio. So I became the de facto music producer then. And, I was working on these attractions that you just mentioned: Twilight Zone, Tower of Terror in Florida, Indiana Jones Adventure in California, Space Mountain in Paris, and then Space Mountain in California, for which I was also the composer on. But through that whole time period, in this mid-90s period, there was a lot of music going on. So we were also doing new background music tracks. Those are what you hear when you walk through the parks and stuff. So we did new recordings, and those are usually like an hour's worth of music. And at the same time, I was working on the virtual reality project, doing sound design and composing music for that. And then I wrote music for the Nautilus submarine walkthrough attraction over in Paris. And then a little bit later, there was the Tiki Room, which we called it the new Tiki Room, but it was the Enchanted Tiki Room that was revised. So it was a really busy time in both music and sound design, and very creative time. So, but to get you to your question, right?
Yeah.
So, Space Mountain down at Disneyland in '95 was when we started working on that. So one day Eddie Sato walks into my office. He was the VP of concept design, I believe, at the time. And he said, "Hey, I've got an idea to put music onto Space Mountain for the first time." And he had a budget, which was really important.
Of course.
So his idea was to fuse two iconic forms of music from the 1960s, right, which were music from sci-fi horror movies and surf guitar music. So the plan was to create a new original score for the sci-fi section, which would take you from the beginning all the way up to the top of the mountain. And then when you start the downhill section, we would do a surf rendition of a piece of music known as Aquarium, which was written by Camille Saint-Saëns back in like the 1880s. It was part of a suite called Carnival of the Animals. So at that point, I probably sat back in my chair and looked had a really surprised look on my face, right? Because I knew that piece of music. Aquarium is like a really floating, soft piece of music, and it's like the antithesis of what you would think of as surf music. So Eddie probably noticed the look on my face at that point, right? And he said, "Don't worry, man." He says, "You'll figure it out. It's going to be great." So it really wasn't until probably sometime later I picked up a guitar and started noodling around on that melody of Aquarium that I figured out, oh, you know what? This actually could work. So at that point, Eddie and I went down to the park and after hours and rode that ride for multiple times with stopwatches and just taking notes, getting timings, and trying to figure out where we wanted the music to kind of shift and change and stuff. And so once I had that info, I went back to my studio and started really just doing quick sketches, musical demos, to try to hone in on the direction and on both pieces of music. And Eddie would come over and we'd bounce ideas off of each other, and we slowly started trying to define the direction and started coming into focus. And at that point, I was really working on both pieces of music at once, kind of bouncing back and forth, because I knew those were going to be two really disparate pieces of music. They still had to make sense somehow, flowing into each other. So, as a matter of fact, I probably rewrote the last several measures of the sci-fi section numerous times, because I kept trying to hone that transition to make it have more sense, even though, like I said, they were so different. It slowly started coming together, and I think, we really had like three main things that we were going for with that ride and that music. And the first was that continuity that I just talked about, right? That it had to make sense, it had to flow. The very end is a reprise of the beginning, the very beginning, and that was purposeful. And so we spent a lot of time working on that. The other thing was pacing. Eddie and I had talked about this, and we wanted to play a little bit on the rider's emotions. I think we've all had this experience. You get onto a thrill ride of some sort, right? And like the first few seconds, you're thinking, "Oh my God, why did I do this?" And so.
Every time.
Yeah, exactly. So we tried to work with that a little bit. So when you first start off with Space Mountain, the music, it's a little mysterious, but it's still kind of fun, right? And then as you start that ascent going up to the top, it gets scarier and scarier. But then we pull it back just a tad, make you feel like, okay, it's going to be okay. And then that last final ascent, 8 seconds or whatever it is to get to the very top, it's like, oh my God, stop this ride, let me off this thing right now. And so I think, we had a little bit of success, I think, with that. And the third thing really was that the whole thing had to be fun, right? The surf section took care of itself. That was nothing, the downhill portion, that was nothing but fun. But the sci-fi section, it really couldn't take itself too seriously. And as a matter of fact, it was really, I consider it a tongue-in-cheek homage to those early sci-fi films. As a matter of fact, if you listen to those early movies from the late 50s, 60s, stuff like that, they all have a certain tonality to them. And one of the things about that attraction is we didn't really have a large budget. And so the sci-fi section was all orchestral, and if we'd have gone into a studio and actually recorded it with live musicians, we wouldn't have been able to get that sound, because of 1990s recording technology was a lot better than what it was in the 60s. So I think the fact that I composed and orchestrated that whole sci-fi section with synthesizers actually benefited us, and it kind of worked out in that way. So anyway. So I kept laying out the whole thing from beginning to end, and with synthesizers, I finished pretty much the sci-fi section and orchestrated that, and had the surf section laid out as well with some temp tracks and real tracks and stuff. And once we had everything lined up like that, we took all the synthesizers and computers over to Studio A in Imagineering, which at that time was really a pretty new studio. It was well built, well designed, well equipped, and we transferred all those parts onto digital multitrack, which was tape based at that point. And so once we were in the studio, the focus became the surf section, because like I said, the sci-fi section was pretty much finished. And so at that point, we brought in a drummer and replaced the drums with live drums. And then I brought in a guitar player named Carl Verheyen, who was a well-known studio musician in Los Angeles, who I'd worked with before. And he replaced the guitar melodies and some of the other guitar parts I had put in with synths and some sweeteners. And then at that point, Eddie had made a deal with this guy named Dick Dale, who was the king of surf guitar back in the 1960s, right? And he was known for these iconic guitar licks. He was kind of a character, and he actually had pet names for these things. Like, they were all dinosaur names. He had like the pterodactyl and the brontosaurus and stuff like that, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah. And like I said, he was quite a character. And so when you hear these kind of loud and aggressive guitar licks, which is what he was known for, that's Dick Dale on the surf section. And it had become rumored over the years that he had written all the music for Space Mountain. But of course, that wasn't the case. But he was our guest artist. And interesting, Eddie had, part of the deal he made is that he would be able to play on the top of the Matterhorn. And when the Disneyland execs heard about that, they freaked out and said, "No way!" They put a quick stop to that whole idea. But Dick Dale did end up playing somewhere in Disneyland.
I think I saw footage of him on top of Space Mountain, actually, which is fitting that he would be up there.
Yeah, I think that's where that happened, right? So anyway, so at that point we had everything recorded, and so it became a question of mixing the music. And the R&D department had actually created the speaker system for the ride, and each guest would have a stereo set of speakers behind their head. And so they brought those over for us so that we could do the mix through those speakers. And then at that point, it was pretty much done, except, the timing was the really challenging part for the surf section, right? It wasn't an issue with the sci-fi because that was mechanical. But what would happen with the surf section, it was downhill, so it was all gravity driven. And what we came to find out is there was about I think it was between 20 and 30 seconds of difference between the slowest ride and the fastest ride. So the reason that was because when the vehicles first started out, the first ones out of the chute, they would run slow because the tracks were cold. And as the day heated up, the tracks would warm up and the vehicle would start going faster. And of course, the amount of people in the vehicle also altered the speed. So anyway, I had to figure out a way to accommodate this so that the most important part was that the end music would be at the end of when you came down the hill and into the onload area, that piece of music needed to play right then. Couldn't be too early, couldn't be too late, right? It had to be right on time. So, without really giving away the Imagineering secret sauce, I was able to figure out a way to make a track that could expand or contract based on the speed of the vehicle. And no matter what, the end music would always play at the right time, at the right place. And like I said, that end piece of music was a reprise of the very first piece of music that started you out on the journey.
Yeah, it's a great piece of music. I think I've mentioned to you, that was one of those soundtracks that I discovered early on as a Disney fan, and it's still like ingrained in my head. And as you're talking about it, I can picture exactly that rising sci-fi emotion as you're ascending to the top, which a lot of my listeners are based in or frequently visit Walt Disney World, a little smaller portion to Disneyland. For those who haven't been to the Disneyland version, it does take a while to get to the top. You have 3 separate lifts to get you up there, and it's basically like a full minute of you rising to the top of Space Mountain. It really builds the anticipation as compared to Walt Disney World. You can just dip straight into this drop and then turn around and go up one main lift and then continue through the rest of the ride. What was it like for you the first time you actually rode the finished product and got to experience it for yourself?
Yeah, it was great. I don't remember if we rode it when the park was open or if we went afterwards. I don't remember right now. But I thought it was great. I thought it worked well. There's some points where, there's track noise, and if you're, if there's a lot of people on the ride, of course, there's people screaming and stuff. So,
of course,
I mean, we ended up compressing that music like really hard so that it just stayed loud the whole time, right? And compression takes like the dynamic range out of music and keeps it all kind of more or less at one level. And that was one of the tricky parts of the mix, was still making it sound good for the ride with all that compression. As a matter of fact, we came back at some point and remixed it for regular listening environments because it really didn't sound all that great on, regular speakers, listening in a normal environment, but it's what we had to do for the ride. So, you can go like, Disney Records has, a version of it that's out there. It's on one of their compilation LPs and stuff. So, and that sounds pretty good to me still. And we were able to get that 60s, that tinny sound of the trumpets and the brass section and stuff like that. So, all that, sometimes not having a big budget actually works in your favor, right?
Absolutely. Was there, the Disneyland Paris version of Space Mountain is quite different. It's a launch coaster. It has a slightly different theme to it. Instead of being in Tomorrowland, it's in Discoveryland with this Jules Verne theme to it, as opposed to that Tomorrowland vision of the future. So, was there any difference in the way in which you had to develop that soundtrack?
Yeah, well, like you said, that was like 180 degrees different than the one in Disneyland. And, that score is really a cinematic, sweeping type of score. And it's, it was the 1990s, and that was kind of the style of what, you heard in films then, think like John Williams type of music and things like that, right? So that was done with a 60-piece orchestra. And Tim Delaney had actually found the composer before I think I got onto the project, and it was a guy named Steve Bramson who had been working on some TV stuff at the time. And so Steve was an orchestral guy. Like I said, it was going to be a 60-piece orchestra, and Tim had an idea of how he wanted that. And again, it was that kind of cinematic sound, very much so. And so... we all went to Paris, Steve and Tim and myself, and to ride the ride, same idea as before with the Disneyland, to get timings and try to identify areas in the ride where we wanted things to change, even though you're looping around and whatnot. But yeah, Tim and I rode that thing multiple times, but the composer had to drop out after like the first or second because he was getting nauseous.
It's intense.
Yeah. It's a funny story about that. Tim Delaney, bless his heart, he booked us all in the Disneyland Hotel, which is like, really nice hotel right there at the entry of the park. And so Steve and I, every morning that we were there, like I think 3 mornings, we met for breakfast at the restaurant there, right? And they all had, that restaurant would always have characters. Goofy just loves Steve, and every morning Goofy would sneak up in back of Steve, the composer, and stick those big hands right in front of his face. And finally, like the 3rd morning, he said to me, "What is it with me with Goofy?" It was like, "What's going on?" And I said, "Hey man, it's Disneyland, and you've got that look, I guess, So, but anyway, so when we went back to LA, Steve went to work on the score, and with all these orchestral stuff, the composer will always work on a synthesized demo so that the creative team and myself can hear it as it's being developed, and make sure that if going in as planned, if anything needs to change, that's kind of the time to do it. So if you need to alter anything, sometimes that would come up. Usually with the composers we used, they were usually really pretty spot on. So once in a while there'd be some course corrections, but once all the music was composed, we went into a scoring stage. I think it was Todd A.O. at the time, and recorded it. And That was all done probably in a morning. Clipped that off pretty quickly. And, you don't do the whole score in one big, fell swoop. It's broken up into cues, and you do, gosh, I don't know how many cues we did for that, probably at least a dozen. And then it gets put back together, later on. But from that point, I took the tapes, the multi-track tapes, and went back to Studio A at Imagineering and started working on the mix with one of our in-house recording engineers. And at that point, it was pretty much just me and the engineer, and we'd make adjustments, just make it sound really good for the ride. If, parts of any of the orchestral sections had to be raised or lowered and stuff, we would take care of that. And so that was it. We delivered the tracks, and I didn't go back to Paris, actually. I think that's one of the rides that I never heard the final result. I had talked to Tim about it. I said, hey, I'd like to go back, and make sure everything's okay. And he was already over there, and he said, yeah, it sounds great. Don't worry about it. So I don't think I ever got back to hear that one.
Yeah, and both Space Mountains now feature scores composed by Michael Giacchino, I believe. So they have like the Space Mountain Mission 2, and it became Hyperspace Mountain over at Disneyland Paris. And the Disneyland version received this major refurbishments, completely gutted and replaced the track, updated the special effects, and then updated, I know, the soundtrack. I think in 2006 it reopened. But I still, again, have these distinct memories of those original scores at both those locations. But there are a couple of attractions you mentioned that the scores haven't changed. And you also talked about, or at least mentioned the name John Williams, and that leads me right into Indiana Jones Adventure, because that attraction, it includes music, originally written by John Williams for the Indiana Jones franchise. I believe there's some themes from Raiders of the Lost Ark and Temple of Doom. I don't believe there's any from The Last Crusade, but talk about an exciting dynamic still to this day. Although the updates, there's been updates made, like still a very similar attraction to how it was on opening day. So how was it for you to work on something again and include music that was themes originally composed by John Williams?
Yeah, that was a fun one. There was two producers on that show, and unfortunately I can't remember their names right now, but they came to me at some point and said, hey, we're doing Indiana Jones, and could you help us out with getting the music done? So that ended up being an 86-piece orchestra, because John Williams used an 86-piece orchestra, so we had to use one, right?
Of course.
And so a lot of that, if not most of it, is direct lifts from the original scores. And I had hired a guy named Richard Bellis, who we'd worked with him before on some other stuff. And he was another orchestral guy, could conduct the orchestra and everything like that. But, somehow he was able to get some of those original scores and started adapting them to what we needed. There was some other original stuff also done for that, especially like the cues and stuff like that. And that was also very interesting music, I thought. But, it's kind of the same drill. We all went down to the park and rode the vehicle. Of course, the attraction wasn't open yet, but the vehicles were running. And I remember we were in the vehicle with the producer, and he would point out certain areas and talk about what he was thinking about and how he wanted it to kind of go. And so once we got those timings and our notes and everything, the composer went back to his studio, and it was almost the same drill as Space Mountain Paris. He worked with a guy who did synth demos for him. And in today's world, if you look on a film credits, it's called a synthesizer programmer, right? So they made demos of what they were working on, and I would go over with the show producers and take a listen. And I don't know if we made any adjustments as they were working on it. Possibly we did, but like I said before, the composers we worked with were usually pretty good at, honing in at what we were trying to do. And so at that point, once we had a buy-off on those demos, we went into Todd AO, which was a big scoring stage in Los Angeles. It's not there anymore, actually, sadly. But we did the recordings, and hats off to the musicianship in LA. I mean, it's just incredible. And if you listen to some of those tracks from Space Mountain, or from, not Space Mountain, but Indiana Jones, some of those cues are really difficult stuff. And again, we did it in sections. We didn't do the whole thing, but I would say by the first run through was always, sometimes it was a train wreck, or sometimes there was a chart problem. Something would always happen, usually on the first run through. But by the second run through, you could be recording, and we probably did. And I'd say by the third one, it was in the bag, and I doubt that we rarely ever went past 4 takes on a particular cue. But it was just, it's just such a pleasure to work in a place like Los Angeles, where they have these just incredible musicians that can just knock this stuff off, and very complicated music. And that was also probably done in one morning or one afternoon. And so at that point, Imagineering had been recording to digital for quite a while. But these scoring stages were still working with analog, like 24-track analog machines. So what I would do is have a digital machine, 32-track digital machine, carted over to the scoring stage and record simultaneously to both analog and digital. Because at that time, digital was still a fairly new medium, and there was a kind of a raging debate, that analog still sounded better, and blah blah blah. So when I got back to Imagineering, I would A/B both versions, digital to analog and stuff. And I think invariably, I always mixed the analog version, because I just felt like the high end was a little smoother. The stereo arc of the string sections, for example, just spread across the stereo spectrum a little smoother. And I don't know if that would be the case today, because in 1990s, compared to today, just the sampling and the converters and stuff like that we had back then just aren't as good as what's available today. So, yeah, I don't know if that would hold true today. So, yeah, it was a fun project.
Yeah, and I think there are times that the timing for that one is a little more set in stone. But I know there are times that the vehicle will sometimes delay slightly if there's a delay ahead. I've been in that scenario, and the music seems to continue to play out a little bit, very similar to the timing you mentioned with Space Mountain, where that obviously is a slightly different situation. It's kind of paused by a computer until it's ready to go again. But it's great to see when it's even become, I think, even more advanced today, where the music is built in such a way that, like, in so many different scenarios, the ride still plays as if it's meant to be that way, which is so impressive.
Yeah, that if I remember correctly, if you get stuck, stalled for several seconds or whatever, and the music track has kind of run its course, I believe another ambient sound effect track comes in, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a long time since I've been on that one, but I did go down there, of course, and rode that around after the music was on, and I thought it worked really well.
Yeah, it sure does. You mentioned a couple of other projects I would definitely talk about at Disney, and going back to, talked about the surf guitar era, the 1960s. Another popular series that emerged even before them was the Twilight Zone, and now you have the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, same year as Indiana Jones Adventure opened, 1994, opening in Walt Disney World. Great time for thrill rides at Disney parks. And here's another example of an iconic, in this case, one iconic theme song from a show that's being, incorporated into an attraction, but that's just one piece of the music for that ride. As you're riding it, it has layers to it that kind of call back to that theme, but then expand upon it. It's got, you talk about background music, the Tower of Terror exterior background music and the music that's played in the lobby is often referenced among Disney fans as one of the best cases of ambient music designed for the parks. So it's certainly a masterclass in Imagineering in multiple areas, including the sound. So what was that project like for you?
Yeah, that was that was another interesting one. That was also Richard Bellis that I got onto that one, and that was a attraction that I don't remember going there beforehand. One of the first ones that, all the other ones we went and checked it out, did timings and stuff like that. But I don't remember now if that was because everything wasn't operational enough, and I don't think the composer went either. But somehow we got timings. I believe they might have just been delivered to us. Here's how long this takes, how long that takes, and whatnot, right? And of course, there's these other things, the parlor scene, and all these various different stages of that attraction, right? But it was, I believe that was also a 60-piece orchestra on some of the bigger sections of the music. And we probably went back to Tadeo again on that one, but there was also smaller ensembles that we used in. And I remember we went to a second studio, a little smaller type of thing that wasn't a big scoring stage, and we did some of those other areas of the music. And there was, like, when you go through the hallway, there's a lot of sound effects and stuff like that was going on. All those orchestral types of things all had the same kind of drill to them, where the composer would start working on the music and create these synthesized demos. And I remember I was on vacation when he started working on that, and I was coming back from, I think I was skiing in Big Bear, and I called him up on my cell phone, and I said, "Hey," I said, "You got anything? I'm going to pass right by your place. You got anything I can listen to?" And him and his helper, the synth guy, they started just kind of laughing, like, "What are you thinking? Yeah, are you just going to come in here from vacation and check out what we're doing?" So anyway, but eventually I can't remember if I did stop by that day or I made it another occasion, but it came along pretty well. Like I said, there's so many different parts to that music, and variations on the theme that happen throughout the ride. And of course, there's the false drop, which is all orchestral music, and then the main drop, which is, happens pretty quickly, but it's a pretty nice little piece of music that takes you all the way down to the end. And that was just fun, both the orchestral recording as well as the small ensemble work and the sound effects. I thought that all came together pretty nicely, actually. And that I ended up going down to see and hear and ride. I think it might have been the opening date of it, and yeah, it was a good attraction.
Yeah,
and of course, a lot of that was also certainly adapted, if not some of it partly lifted from the original TV scores. And some of it, was original music as well. So it was kind of a combination. And of course, the famous theme was, a direct lift, of course, that we re-recorded. And so a lot of different parts that went into that particular ride.
Yeah. I want to definitely talk about the VR project that you mentioned, Disney Vision. A small sort of insert here before we get to that, because you alluded to background music, and we talked about, or I just mentioned the background music for Tower of Terror being one of those a fan favorite. And you sort of referenced developing some background music at your time at Disney. So, are there any particular favorites that the fans might recognize that you did develop for the parks?
gosh, we did several background music tracks, and usually the way those would work is we'd hire a composer. I don't think I composed any music for any of that stuff. The way those would work is we'd hire, usually it was either Richard Bellis or George Wilkins, who had been with Disney for years. As a matter of fact, I think back in the 80s, he was the head of the music department in Imagineering, and then he left. And I met him somewhere along the line, but George and I worked on bunches of stuff, and there was when you do an hour's worth of music, it's a lot of stuff. So they would also bring in some other arrangers, and so there'd probably be 2 or 3 people working on an hour's worth of music, and then usually those went into a smaller studio somewhere, and we would record those that way. Tiki Room was one that we did in a small studio, and the smaller projects like that, sometimes I'd be more hands-on because it's just more relaxed and you make changes on the fly. You don't do that so much with a orchestral score unless it's something drastic, and that's why we had those synthesizer demos, right? So that the last thing you want is a big surprise when you get into a scoring stage with an 86-piece orchestra. That's an expensive day.
Yeah. Oh, it definitely is.
Yeah. But when you do it in a 5 or 6 piece ensemble or whatever in a small studio, it's a lot more relaxed. You can stop and talk about maybe making changes to, certain parts of the music and stuff like that. But all those background music tracks that we did, we'd probably record those over a course of a couple days to get it all done, maybe longer. There's just a lot of music, and then the same thing. We'd mix it down into mono or stereo, whatever was needed, and So, and then the Nautilus walkthrough attraction was kind of fun in a way. That was, right next to Space Mountain in the lagoon. So it's a walkthrough based on the submarine from the Jules Verne thing, right? And so Tim Delaney came into my office one day and he says, "Hey, we got this Nautilus Jules Verne thing. It's going to be a walkthrough. When you start out, there's going to be all these cool things you can see about the submarine and everything. And then you get to the bridge, and there's the big portal, and the giant squid's going to come and attack the sub. So we need some music for that." So I said, "Oh, okay, cool." So I went home that night and knocked off this kind of, quick demo. And come back the next day and I call up Tim. I says, "Hey, I got something. Why don't you come down and take a listen?" So he comes in my office and I play the track. And he says, "I love it." And I said, "Oh, great. We'll take it in the studio. We'll add some parts, change this and that, make it really nice." And he says, "No, I love that." And I said, "Well, it's just a quick demo, right?" And he says, "No, I love it. Give me the tape right now." So I think he actually got up and pulled the tape out of the machine and walked out the door. And I'm sure I was like watching him go down the hallway with me yelling at him, "It's not done. It needs more stuff." And that was the last I heard or saw of it until sometime later. That was that. So that's sometimes, sometimes it's good not to overthink these things, right?
Yeah, sometimes that first attempt is the right one, just to get the circumstances fit.
That's very much often the case, and that's probably one of the issues, I think, with modern recording technology like Pro Tools and stuff, where you can have, a gazillion tracks if you want. It gives you too many options, and I think producers today will just say, "Let's do another one, let's do another one," and they just keep piling up, take after take of different parts or whatever it is, and then you have to wade through all that and try to make a decision. And it's different, far different than when we had 24 tracks, or back in the old days when they had 4-track or 2-track or whatever it was, right? And, I used to do these sessions back in the day when I was a recording engineer. The great George Clinton, who was known for Funkadelic and Parliament and those bands and stuff. Back in the 80s, he was really busy, and he would come into Los Angeles and he'd have multiple studios going at once, right? And so he had really competent guys that would come in. And so I worked on a lot of those sessions. But George would come in and listen to the bass part or whatever, and he'd say, yeah, that's good. Or no, let's redo it. Just like that, he knew exactly what he wanted. If it sounded right, it sounded right. If it didn't, they'd redo it, and it would take a matter of minutes, but he didn't say, let's do another one, let's try a different thing. Record 20 tracks of, that one particular part. So, modern technology certainly has its benefits. I mean, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it can be, a detriment as well.
Yeah, it's great to keep it simple. Now, thinking about the development of spaces, as you talk about the Nautilus, as I sort of alluded to a few moments ago, the Disney Vision project, which I honestly was not too familiar with before you had mentioned it to me. I think the timing of, I was a younger kid, didn't really know too much about it. It was really, I think, even early on in the VR space. You talk a little bit about that project and your work on it?
Yeah, sure. Man, that was quite a project, and I'm not surprised you didn't hear about it. I think it really was one of the unsung heroes of that time period. And but I was in Paris, actually working on what was then called Euro Disney at the time. Mm-hmm. And I was over there, and I heard that Imagineering was going to start up a VR project. So literally, the day I got back to Imagineering, I went and found John Snoddy's office, who was going to head up the project, and I leaned in his door and I said, "Hey, John," I said, "I want to be your 3-dimensional sound designer." And he, looked up and said, "Oh, okay." And luckily, he was just putting the team together right about that time. So I got on the project, and but what was incredible about that project? It wasn't so much that it turned out to be a grand attraction of some sort. It was really more about the company's steadfast commitment to a grand experiment without any known outcome that could be counted on. And it wasn't the kind of thing where, hey guys, we're just experimenting, let's keep the budget really tight. It was quite the opposite. Really was. And, to Disney's credit, they've never been one to shy away from technology, new technology. And if they think it's something that can be transformative, something that can help them tell the story better, they're all in. They lean into it. They don't shy away from it. So, but we weren't the first VR project to the party by any means, right? NASA and Jet Propulsion Laboratory, I know, had been investing pretty heavily in it before us. And there was a couple of companies, Sega, and I think one called Virtuality, I think it was. They were ahead of us, I believe. And I also believe that they were focused on games. And Disney, of course, we had a totally different focus. We were focused on a new way to tell a story. And Disney's nothing if they're not a storyteller, right?
Right.
So if there was a new way to engage a guest in a compelling, interactive, experiential kind of environment, or not a ride, but an experience, they were all into it, and they wanted to find out what the possibilities were. So we built a really talented team of, animators, software people, and we took over a building that's known as the bowling alley. I don't know if they still call it that, but it was on the Imagineering campus, and they actually had some bowling alleys in there that were used for parties at the time. But we had this big, huge space. It's probably, 3,000 square feet or something. It was all open except for this one enclosure, like a little office that was for my studio, right? Because I built a sound studio in there, so it had to be enclosed. And it was top secret. You had to have a special access card to get into that building. We couldn't, as a matter of fact, we couldn't even talk about it.
Strictly confidential.
Yeah. And so we just went about it, and my job was to create three-dimensional immersive soundscapes. So I put into my little production studio, I put, samplers and synthesizers and reverbs and all that kind of stuff. But we also had these kind of, I guess what you might consider at the time, more exotic forms of audio production, which were binaural heads and tools that could spatialize and localize a sound within a 3D environment so you could hear them the way we would hear sounds in the real world. So in other words, height, distance, side to side, front to back. And so for instance, if you had a bird up in the tree, it would sound like it was, above you and to your right or left or wherever. And we could have it fly down and land on your shoulder, and it could fly off into the distance, and all that would sound, appropriate to how you would actually hear it in the real world. And so, those were spatialized and localized. And on top of that, I was taking, Imagineering had a couple binaural heads, which are these recording devices that look just like your head with microphones in the ears, but they record stunning reproductions of whatever environment you're recording. So you could go into out into the forest, for instance, right, and record all that ambience with the birds and whatever else is going on. And when you take it back and play it for somebody with headphones, it has to be with headphones for it to be realistic, they'd swear, "Oh my God, I'm out in the middle of the forest." So I was adding these really deep ambience into these soundtracks that we were producing. So the sense of depth that we were creating with the VR project was really incredible. And there wasn't much expense spared as far as what we were putting into the VR ride itself. So as I remember, we wanted to have the headphones, the sound system off of the guest ears, so we didn't have to worry about, having to clean them and everything like that. So we found these really, really expensive, I think they were AKG headphones that would sit like about an inch off of your ears. And they were something like $1,500 a pair.
Wow.
And they would attach to the head-mounted display, which was also another, amazing piece of technology that, they put a lot of work into. But I remember that, we bought all these headphones, numerous sets of these headphones, and the engineers would take the actual speaker parts off. They were enclosed in a wire mesh. They would take that wire mesh speaker and attach it to the head-mounted display and rewire it. Well, for some reason, these were wired kind of backwards to the norm. And I think they blew up like 3 sets of those things.
Oh, no.
$1,500 a pop before they figured, I think maybe we should change the wiring. But anyway, we had just a lot of interest in that project because, like I said, the potential was unknown. It was really unknown at that point. And so Michael Eisner would come over, Jeffrey Katzenberg, to hear our demos fairly frequently. Marty Sklar, of course, was over, and even like Martin Scorsese came at one point. And we had this demo stage that we had built, and so people could get up there and ride the VR ride. And as a matter of fact, Diane Sawyer, I think she was an anchor for ABC, something like that, and she had set up an interview for somebody in the project. Maybe it was John or the head of the project. And so I remember I wasn't there that day, but I was told about this, that Diane Sawyer is out there banging on the door because, of course, the doors are locked, right? And everybody forgot about her, was out to lunch or whatever the case, but she was out there banging away on the door trying to get in to do this interview. And it wasn't until finally somebody from the project walked up and swiped her in, But,
wow.
Yeah. But there was just, a lot of interest and a lot of high hopes for the potential. And, we experiment. I was on that thing for at least 3 years. That was the experimental phase. And the storytelling was one thing that proved to be difficult. You have all these branching things that, the guests can kind of go anywhere. So you have to come up with this branching storytelling that, you don't know all the scenarios that a guest could get themselves into, right? So it has to be compelling, at least back in that day. So, when you think of traditional storytelling, the story leads the guest where the story wants the guest to go, right? Well, in VR, it can be quite the opposite, where the guest can lead the story where they want the story to go. So you have to be able to accommodate all that, but it still has to be compelling. No matter what they do, you have to be able to make it like really a compelling story and get them out of that particular place. And so it was very difficult. And so I stayed on that through the experimental period. And at that point, I kind of felt like I had done all that I could for that project for the most part. And then at the same time, we got a new person over at the audio video department. And he was starting up, he was our new manager, and he was starting up the media design group. It was brand new at that time. So he recruited me into that. And so I was one of the original media designers at that point.
That's amazing. Such a, like you said, a experimental project, even some of the things that you mentioned, I could see how they became, had their applications for that as using this as sort of a proving ground for it, which is, it's great you got to work on that. We could probably spend a lot of time talking about all the projects you worked on at Disney. For sake of time, I know that you did some incredible work beyond Walt Disney Imagineering as well. So, moving beyond Disney, what are some of your favorite projects you've worked on since?
Yeah, so I left Disney in '97, and John Snoddy, who ran the VR project, he had already left, and he hooked up on a project that was like a pet project with Steven Spielberg, and it was a combination between Sega and GameWorks, I believe, and maybe Universal, and it was going to be a motion-based simulator ride with a Jeep based on Jurassic Park kind of theme. With VR and three-dimensional sound design. So I had talked to John, and he offered me a contract to come over and work on that project. So I decided to leave Disney and go back out on my own, and that was a blast. They had a binaural head. I would take that to the hinterlands up like in Big Bear Lake and stuff, and go to these back roads that were filled with mud and water. And my friend would hold the binaural head in the back seat. I had a rental Jeep. I rented a Jeep from LA, and we'd drive through these things, and we'd be recording all these weird places. And I remember I took the Jeep back and to the agency, and the lady came out and she said, "Oh my God, what did you guys do?" It's like, and I said, "Don't worry, it's all mud; it'll wash off." And I scurried out really quickly, But that was a short-lived project. It never came to fruition. I never found out exactly why, but luckily I'd already established a contract with Sony Development, and some Imagineers had already moved over to that project, and they were building what was known as location-based entertainment centers at the time, and they were doing one in San Francisco. It was a brand new building, and they were also going to do one in Berlin and Tokyo. So I worked on all three of those, and they had all kinds of different things in those buildings. Probably the most fun one for me was the Yellow Submarine, which was another motion-based simulator ride. And it was a combination. Sony had made a deal with Apple Records, which of course was the Beatles record company. And at that point, it turned into really to more of their management. They kind of managed their affairs and enterprises and stuff. And so this was going to be, the Yellow Submarine ride based on the film. And I was working on the sound effects and putting the music track together, which of course was all Beatle music. And I ended up getting summoned to London because of an edit I made in one of their famous songs, All You Need Is Love, right? I had cut out something in the middle, like I needed to shorten that track for some reason. I cut like a verse out or a chorus. So they sent me, the Apple Records people had come over to check out our progress, and they heard that edit, and they weren't happy about it for some reason, right? So they brought me over to London to Abbey Road Studios to find out the do's and don'ts of editing Beatle music.
Wow.
So I still remember, we were having a meeting over at Abbey Road Studios, which of course is a famous studio where they recorded all those albums. And we're having this meeting, and Neil Aspinall is in the meeting. He was the CEO now of Apple Records. And he had known the Beatles since way before they were famous, because he was their road manager, right? And he was the road manager because he owned a van. And if you've ever been in a musical group or a band, you know that if you have a friend who owns a van, that's a really high value asset for you, right?
Yeah.
Because they can schlep all your equipment around. So anyway, he'd stayed in their orbit all those years, and he was the guy they trusted at that point, so they made him the CEO. So anyway, we're having this meeting, and Neil says, "Come on, let's go downstairs, get some coffee or whatever." And they had this little cafeteria or cafe down the lower level of the studio, which was a huge complex. And so I'm standing next to Neil, ordering coffee or whatever, and he pats me on the back and he says, "Don't worry, mate." He says, "You didn't know." He says, "But here's the cardinal rule of editing Beatle music. You can take a little off the front. You can take a little off the back. But don't blankety blank with anything in the middle." And that was it. That was the whole lesson, like right there in the cafeteria, right? And so the rest of the time I was there, we just hung out, listened to music, and heard, tales of the Beatles, time there, and toured the studio, and it was a lot of fun.
That's so cool. Could have been an email or a phone call, and ended up being a fun trip to London.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I'm glad it happened. I had never been to Abbey Road before.
Yeah, that's so cool. Well, thinking overall about your career, and you've worked on such incredible projects, and have at Disney and beyond, and have certainly had a very successful career. And I know there may be some music professionals listening, and those who may want to, I actually do know some music professionals are listening, and some may want to try to break into themed entertainment, whether that's at Walt Disney Imagineering or another competing theme park or museum or whatever it might be. Do you have any advice for what it takes to succeed and thrive in that industry?
Wow, yeah, that's quite a question, because
it could be answered in 30 seconds, right? No.
Yeah. Well,
take the time you need.
If you took my route, you'd make a cold call and end up at Disney.
Right.
And
try
like
your
said
luck.
Earlier, you can't really do that today so much, and back then you could. But, my whole thing getting into Disney was like a coincidence in a lot of respects, Like I said, it wasn't even on my radar, but gosh, I think with my only advice, I think, would be, you just really need to learn the craft, and if it's going to be music, you need to really know all aspects of it. And, for me, it was knowing how to create music, to write it, and having that knowledge. But then, I did learn how to be a recording engineer. So, my frustration back then was really not having a good command. So I just decided I needed to learn that and to understand how that whole process works. And, you can be in the digital domain working on stuff, and that's okay for, a good chunk of it. But there's a lot of other depths to it, with actually being in a recording studio and understanding microphones and understanding the recording console and all the available technology that can go into this, and to be able to use it correctly. Speaking of the Beatles, I mean, they would misuse technology sometimes to their benefit, but George Martin knew how, what it was supposed to be, and once you understand the rules, then you can break the rules, right? So I think it's just a real dedication and getting yourself out there, and I think within Imagineering, for me, it was really that I treated it as an entrepreneur. And I think in that environment, I don't know if everybody does that, but for me, what worked was being entrepreneurial and finding out, what projects were coming up, like the VR project I heard about, and I just, got myself in there by presenting myself and saying, hey, I want to be on this project, and made myself available to do that. So I think within Imagineering, I don't think you can be shy. You probably can't wait for somebody to come down the hallway and tap you on the shoulder and say, you're just the person we were looking for, right? I think you have to be a little more entrepreneurial and find the opportunities and see if you can land on there. And I think it's the same if you're outside, trying to get into a company like Disney or whatever, that, I think these days it's probably a lot of connections and networking and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and there's a lot of that key theme of having an entrepreneurial spirit and taking initiative is one that I've heard many times in one form or another, and certainly is a great piece of advice. But Aarin, this has been such a pleasure getting to chat with you, hear all these stories, and I thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Welcome back to Imagination Central. As you disembark, please remember to remain fully seated until the podcast comes to a complete stop. Then gather your belongings and watch your head and step as you exit. I once again want to extend a tremendous thank you to Aarin for joining me on today's episode and for his work at Walt Disney Imagineering. If you haven't done so already, be sure to create a free Imagination Skyway account over at patreon.com/Imagination Skyway. I am continuing to turn this into a one-stop shop for Imagination Skyway content, for podcast episodes, and a lot more. So be sure to create a free account there, or you could consider signing up for one of our paid subscription options for even more surprises. In fact, if you already have an account, please be sure to leave your thoughts about today's discussion directly on this episode in the Patreon app. Remember, you can also engage with the show on social media by searching for Imagination Skyway on your favorite app, or head to imaginationskyway.com. And if you're ready to book your next Disney vacation, or you have questions as you prepare for your next Disney trip, be sure to contact our travel partners at KMV Travel, a sponsor of Imagination Skyway and a boutique travel agency that helps families plan personalized vacations and create unforgettable memories on land and at sea. Kelly and her team are an amazing resource, and I encourage you to reach out to them, take advantage of their expert knowledge, their world-class service, and complimentary booking support by heading to kmvtravel.com/skyway, or simply find KMV Travel on social media and let them know Imagination Skyway sent you. Thank you so much for riding aboard Imagination Skyway, and remember, if we can dream it, we can do it.